This is Africa in Focus with Awad Mustafa and Mohammed Al-Sayari. For our first episode, we are honored to host Natznet Tesfay.
Natznet Tesfay is Africa Director with IHS Markit's Economics and Country Risk Business. Her areas of specialization include political and commercial developments affecting the power, energy, mining, and infrastructure sectors in Africa.
Great to have you with us.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
In July 2019, we saw the African Free Trade Agreement going into force, creating the initial phases of the largest single market in the world. Where does it stand now with the global crisis?
Well, we've seen that the appointed secretariat for the FCTA, Wamkele Mene, was very vocal about this in March as the lockdown measures started to come in and flagged that there was likely to be some delays to the timeline because initially they wanted it to formally launch a year to date, so in July of this year. But as you can imagine, some of the prerequisite activities have been affected by this. They were meant to be ongoing negotiations amongst trade ministers around issues like rules of origin, what's going to be the tariff liberalization schedule, things that are politically divisive in the best of times, and even more so if countries are going through economic difficulty. We've heard signals from the AU and from supporting multilateral African agencies that this is likely to continue apace. We've seen African business groups come out calling for the AFCTA not to be delayed more than necessary in light of the lockdown measures. So there's definitely growing appetite for it, which means that there's equally a likelihood that once lockdowns are eased, and we've already seen some countries like Ghana and South Africa move in that direction, the momentum around the negotiations are likely to pick up. But again, we have to imagine that there's going to be some logistical difficulties. These negotiations aren't as effective virtually. So it may take some time to iron out those final stages of phase one, which would have been able to support the launch of the free trade agreement in July. So now they're looking at a potential delay to the end of this year. It presents an opportunity for Africa to create or to promote the industries that will help them grow out of the pandemic and the disruption that it's caused. If we look at regional value chains and now the business case being made for that, as people see it as a way of creating resilience, that countries are likely to be more effective when they develop regional value chains around their specific comparative advantages, and they become self-reliant, not necessarily on an individual basis, but on a block basis, whether that's the East African community or COMESA, or the AFCTA community at large.
What does this mean for countries that are in transition? Countries like Sudan, Ethiopia, in a sense, and other countries in the Central and East African bloc?
Well, we've noticed that when there's domestic instability, it will distract away from these broader initiatives. It falls to the back burner because they're often seen as something that is separate to what's happening within the national borders. But one thing that this pandemic and the waves of impacts from the disruption have affected Africa. We're no longer an isolated continent as we may have been 20 years ago. And it's become increasingly clear that the road to recovery is going to include some cooperative development, and around regional value chains and trade is an area that many are promoting to get people to step outside of whatever might just be their domestic troubles. To flip it on its other side, one critique that has been levied against the Ethiopian Prime Minister is perhaps he's too focused on the regional aspirations and not sufficiently focused on the domestic issues. And so there's also that pressure as well on elected leadership that the population themselves are not necessarily ready or informed about what the benefits of opening up will be. And indeed, that's been a lot of the criticism and the challenges to the AFCTA initiative. You have domestic business groups who feel that they're going to face undue competition from larger neighbors or larger economies in the region. And so it's ensuring that small to medium enterprises and on the civilian level, every citizen is aware of what the benefits are and what protections are in place from AFCTA.
What are the opportunities at this time in Africa?
The opportunities, if we're looking at where the continent has a mainstay, so in commodity exports, these are going to be subject to global price dynamics, and so both the actual price and the demand. And so what we're focusing on ourselves is sectors within the economy that the government is likely to have more control. We can see that there's likely to be an increase in government investments and support mechanisms around healthcare. Projects are likely to be also receive donor supports in order to pursue those. So things within the medical supplies. We've even seen manufacturers domestically already transition from, let's say, alcohol production to hand sanitizer production. So that's a market response to this new opportunity. This will gradually bleed into the development of light industry on the continent. So whether it's to provide lower tech required medical supplies, or it's to provide the initial stages of agro-processing and final products eventually. Additionally, you have ongoing efforts more broadly around import substitution because of the previous commodity price decline and the impacts on the region. And so there was a focus on textiles as well. So that's likely to be an area. One other thing the government has really tried to push forward is the availability of services through technology. We have a race of two companies or consortiums trying to provide sea cables that would provide unprecedented capacity and bandwidth to Africa and lower data costs. So thinking about anything that could be delivered through technical platforms. So there's been more of a focus on increasing the access of mobile money, e-commerce and retail. And as a result of that, transport logistics and courier services that are likely to grow. Because as much as we've seen spending patterns change in other parts of the world because of the pandemic and lockdown, this is likely to open up the appetite within the African consumer base as well. And you see that the infrastructure provision is going to allow for that to happen almost within a year or so of the appetite for those services emerging.
Fair enough. Can I get your insight specifically about the food security investments from the Middle East?
So probably one of the more notable investment communities in Africa's food security. And this is going to be a sector, or agriculture more broadly, is going to be under more scrutiny for two reasons. Prior to COVID, we have an infestation of locusts that is affecting the agricultural exporters in East Africa. And the swarms are larger than the size of Manhattan, devouring crops at an incredible rate. And so it means that these countries were already facing a domestic food supply potential issue. Now, this swarm could potentially move, depending on breeding and travel patterns, back up into North Africa and even to West. So this could become more of an issue. I can't necessarily predict the locust pattern, but there is a concern that the AU and FAO have put out about food security across these affected countries. Now, that's compounded by the supply chain disruptions that we've had from COVID and the lockdowns, and countries now are realizing how much they're food import dependent. Between these two factors, we're likely to see that governments will have no choice but to look at the agricultural sector as a way of import substitution so that they have domestic security supply. It would have also the added benefit of bringing down their import bill if they're producing more of these foodstuffs locally. Africa, if they were to have greater productivity per hectare, are more than capable of feeding domestic populations. So there are going to be opportunities there for investors who want to get involved in agri-tech and upskilling agricultural productivity as these countries are looking for greater food self-reliance and sufficiency, not just because of the locusts, but also because of the COVID impact. This is a space where we're likely to see more investors coming in, and likely that could mean more competition for Gulf investors. It depends on where the appetite is and how quickly, first mover advantage, I should say.
What are the details of financial restructuring going across the continent?
So as we saw the COVID-19 epidemic turn into a pandemic indeed, and spread across the world, we saw that Africa was a region that wasn't immediately hit by it, but we could already start to see the impacts of the pandemic and the associated lockdowns and other measures that led to economic disruption having an impact on the African continent. And that's because today the African continent is more integrated in the global economy and financial market than it was during the global financial crisis of 2007-8. And it's more integrated than it was even a few years ago during the commodity price decline. So we're seeing that prior to the actual virus landing on the African continent, economic fragilities were arising. That was why Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia, with the support of finance ministers across Africa, put out a plea to donors and creditors to provide Africa with a $150 billion relief package. Now, some of that was to respond to the crisis at hand. So enhanced funding for healthcare, but a large part of that, 44 billion, was around relief on debt servicing obligations this year. So this is the financial restructuring, or the beginning of the appeal to start this financial restructuring. The timing of it was just before the spring meetings at the IMF and a G20 summit. And so we saw at those gatherings that there was commitment to at least provide some relief on official debt extended to these African countries. While that is an admirable feat, the composition of Africa's debt profile has changed since the HIPC, or the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Debt Relief Program in the earlier 2000s. Now, much less of Africa's debt, external debt, is held by official donors or creditors like the IMF. A lot more of Africa's debt is held by private creditors or bilateral debt that's held by countries that won't necessarily follow through with the IMF guidelines. some might offer some debt relief or at least relief on interest payments. But what we find is there are a number of African countries where what really is going to matter is the ongoing negotiations that were launched in the middle of May by Tijani Tem on behalf of the Africa Private Sector or Private Credit Working Group. And this is going to be something that's critical if we're going to understand how well Angola, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Zambia, among others, are going to be able to respond not just to the immediate public health crisis, but the unfolding economic crisis. And in Africa's case, there is a risk of a financial crisis in the domestic banking sectors after stimulus measures expire.
Where do you think Gulf investors can benefit in Africa at this stage?
I think generally a point for investors and key trade partners with Africa is there's likely to be a greater emphasis on what productive capacity are you bringing to the country rather than what are you extracting from. And so they're going to be looking at investors who are willing to get involved in the value-added processes within the borders before an export is sent abroad. So anyone who's involved in value addition around any of raw commodities, whether it's a mineral or an agricultural product, there will be appetite for that. Related to that, there's going to be appetite around transport and logistics because they're going to want to have increased trade, not just with other regions in the world, but an increased trade with each other. It could be the development of dry ports in landlocked countries. It could be the connection through air traffic or other forms of cargo movement within the continent, but there's likely to be more opportunities in that space as well. If we look at the investments to date, transport infrastructure has been heavily dominated by Chinese investment. But considering most of Africa's debt that will not necessarily be captured in the ongoing restructuring process that the IMF has led is either Chinese held or private credit, then there's an opportunity for other investors to come in with other financing structures that will not necessarily burden the current debt profile, but also provide the investment opportunity that they need, whether it's transport infrastructure or the other examples I raised.
Thank you very much, Natznet, for your valuable insights, and thank you for joining us for episode 1 of Africa in Focus.
My pleasure, Awad and Mohammed. Thank you for having me today, and many congratulations on launching Africa in Focus.
Thank you for listening to Africa in Focus. We look forward to your questions, comments, and suggestions. You can reach us on team@actum.ac. Don't forget to share and subscribe, and we will see you next time.